Hey guys, and welcome to the week 3 edition of the Fantasy Points XFL breakdown. I'm your host, Jake Tribbey, and I've got Chris Wecht here by my side to help us break down every angle of the week 3 XFL slate. Chris, how are you doing today? And how did your DFS teams do in week 2?
I'm doing good, Jake. Excited for week 3. Another fun week of trying to guess what these subpar football teams are going to do on the
Exactly.
weekend. Week 2 was not great, no, but not terrible. I think I more or less came out even on the day. It was a weird day where there was some high scoring QBs, but like there was no good stack, and I really thought last week was a good chance to capitalize on bigger game stacks with two of the games looking like good shootout options and the other two no, which kind of happened. It just both teams kind of just really spreaded the ball out and to some very low owned guys that I didn't end up using much of. So it is what it is.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I had a decent sweat in the $15. I actually had two teams that I thought were decently live for the 50K. I needed 11 second half DraftKings points out of Canella and Kirkland, and they both posted second half duds. So that was a little disappointing, but I did use the fantasy points projections to make my lineups, and had 9% of my teams in the top 0.1%. So certainly can't complain about that. Alrighty, well, let's get into these games. Our first game is the Seattle Sea Dragons at the Vegas Vipers. This is a Saturday, 7 p.m. kickoff, the only game on Saturday. Total here is 38, highest total of the slate, and Seattle is favored by 3 points here. All right. So the big news with this game, obviously, is that Brendan Knox is out on the Seattle side. We can talk about this pass game and stuff, but really, the slate sort of starts and ends with Morgan Ellison, who I thought looked really, really good last week. And, I think 69% of snaps, decently high route share. He's really going to dominate this backfield. He's only 4,600. I mean, it's kind of a what's not to love situation. I do have a gripe with the Seattle backfield, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts there on this, this running back situation.
No, I think you pretty much nailed it. I think coming following week 2, I think you actually had messaged me and said it looks like the bell cow is pretty much dead in the XFL. But now with
Yeah.
like Knox being ruled out, there's some other stuff we'll get to later on. We actually Ellison looks like as close to what we can consider some kind of a bell cow this week and projects very well. And I mean, he's going to be popular, but there's only so many decent running back plays really anyway, where you're not just hoping for a touchdown somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So, expanding on sort of what I said earlier, I do have one minor gripe here with this backfield, and you'll look at the projections, and most people will probably think I can't fade Morgan Ellison. He's a lock button play, and I certainly understand that line of thinking, but we have to remember that this is one of the least valuable backfields in the XFL. Through 2 weeks, the entire backfield is only averaging 13 weighted opportunity points per game, which is 43% worse than St. Louis, and like drastically worse than a team like Arlington as well. So there really isn't a huge backfield pie here, and a big part of that is because these running backs really don't have much touchdown equity. Cody Main from Establish the Run tweeted that Seattle is actually throwing 90% of the time inside the 10-yard line, and they're always going for three. So there's really no chance of like a rushing conversion for any
Right.
of these guys. So, I do think you can get away with fading Ellison because, there's just no TD equity there. He could get an 80% snap share and only end up with, 6, 7, 8 DraftKings points if he doesn't find the end zone. I do think he's a really talented runner, and, obviously the snaps are going to be there and the price is great, but he's not a perfect play.
No. There's other running backs I'd rather play over him. But yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see what people do with him because of how much Seattle passes the ball. And Danucci was upping his rushing rate last week too.
Yeah. Yeah, and
So
he,
that's
he looked
another.
pretty good as a runner. So
Yeah.
I'd expect that we see a bit more of that this week. Ellison's ownership is tough. I think it's probably going to end up somewhere between 50 and 70% would be my guess. That's a pretty big range, and it gives you a lot of opportunity to gain some leverage on some of these other running backs we'll discuss later. The Seattle passing attack, I think this is a pretty straightforward conversation here. Ben DiNucci, they're throwing, 70% of the time. DiNucci looks good as a runner. He's been hit or miss as a passer, but the bottom line is they're throwing a ton. They're throwing a ton in the red zone, and they're going for 3 every time. And I've been thinking about these 3-point conversions a lot. I mean, it counts as 3 points for the passer as well. So 3-point conversion for 75% of a passing touchdown. I'm not saying like a situation like this is likely, but we could see DiNucci throw 3 passing touchdowns and score 3 3-point conversions. That's 21 DraftKings points on touchdowns and conversions alone, not even counting the yardage. So, I mean, we have DiNucci as the highest projected quarterback of the slate. I think by, several points, which is, I'm pretty confident in that projection. I think we can pretty safely project him to be the highest scoring passer because of, what I said, the conversions and everything like that. So what's your take on the Seattle passing game? What wide receivers do we want to target here?
So the one note, if you do want to play DiNucci, and really if you're playing any of the more popular Seattle running or receivers, I think you kind of have to play DiNucci with them. And if you're playing DiNucci, you probably want to play 2 pass catchers from Seattle, just because he's going because he's going to be the most highly projected QB on all the sites. He's going to be the most popular because of that. You really need a ceiling outcome from him, and that means he's throwing at least 2 touchdowns, and like you said earlier, 3-point conversions count for 3 for him and 3 for whoever catches the ball.
Yep. Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think if you're looking for some lower owned options with DiNucci, I mean, it's pretty obvious. It's Josh Gordon and Jordan VC. You mix those guys in with Jakur Pearson and Blake Jackson, and you've got some interesting stacks there. I also think, not that this is something I'll do on many teams, but I might actually triple stack DiNucci on a few teams. So one final note on Seattle is that industry-wide, DiNucci's projection is actually pretty close to other quarterbacks. I think we're by far the highest on him. A few other sites have him pretty close to guys like Silvers, Cone, Sloter, which I just think is a mistake. I mean, I think we can pretty safely project him, 3-4 more DraftKings points than the next closest quarterback. So he won't pop as a very strong value industry wide, but I do still think he'll be pretty highly owned there.
Yeah, I wonder if that keeps his ownership a little bit in check because of him not popping as a value as much. But yeah, I feel pretty good about having him. What are we at? It's a little less than 3 more points than the next closest QB in our projection.
Yeah, I feel pretty good about that as well. We'll get to some of these stronger value quarterbacks ahead. Quarterback ownership, I think, is a really interesting debate, and I'm still not quite sure where the chips are going to fall there. Moving on to Vegas, I mean, really the only thing to talk about here is the Vegas passing attack, and I'm pretty excited about some Brett Hundley stacks. I thought Hundley looked respectable in what was, just terrible field and weather conditions last week. And we got to remember that he's right there with AJ McCarron as the most experienced NFL quarterback playing spring football right now. He's only 7,400. In our projections, we actually have him as the pretty clear top value at the quarterback position. I do not think ownership is going to reflect that. I think he'll be probably at most quarterback 3 in terms of ownership, somewhere in the 10 to 15% range. And I love that. I think I'm going to play a decent bit of Hundley, and the pairing's pretty straightforward. You can pair him with Badette, pair him with Martavis Bryant. Geronimo Allison is also viable there. He suffered a shoulder injury last week, but he practiced in full all week, so I'm not too worried about him. What's your take on this Vegas passing attack?
Yeah, Hundley is one of my favorite QBs, I think, of this slate. I don't like the Vegas offense was much better with him in the game than it was with Luis Perez last week.
Yeah.
Like the entire team got better. And yeah, he's definitely gonna be the best value at QB. You pretty much know his 3 receivers, so you have a pretty condensed target tree or target share tree, and stack them up any way you want. Badette is probably my favorite of the bunch because he definitely projects the best for us, and also it doesn't look like ownership is going to be too crazy on him either. So yeah, mix and match the Vegas QB stacks, and you're not going to have to eat too much ownership to do it.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think it's a pretty unique way to play this game because everyone's going to want, DiNucci plus the Seattle passing attack and then maybe, tack on a Vegas receiver. But if you go, you do a Hundley double stack, you can play Jakur Pearson
They
and
play Pearson, and
yeah,
you're
yeah,
not
it'd be
even to have to be worried about being too chalky.
exactly. It's a super gross split right now. I am not very anxious to play anyone. John Lovett led the backfield in weighted opportunity last week. But yeah, I'm
Yeah,
not.
I'm
There are
out on
just
the
way
running
better
backs.
options.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's no reason to play them.
Yeah. All right. Moving on to the first game on Sunday, we actually have a 3-game Sunday slate, and DraftKings made 3-game Sunday slate contest with 20K to first. So if you want to just skip that Saturday game and compete for some big money Sunday only, that's a viable option, which I absolutely love. So yeah, we got the St. Louis Battlehawks at the DC really strong home field advantage, although we haven't seen St. Louis play at home quite yet. This is a 1 p.m. Sunday kickoff. Total is 36.5. DC is favored by 2 points. A lot of crucial injuries here. Brian Hill looks questionable. Marcel Aitman looks questionable. The DC defenders are also missing 2 offensive line starters. Starting with St. Louis, this passing attack is really interesting, especially if we assume Aitman sits. That sort of opens the door for guys like Hakeem Butler and Darius Shepard to earn significantly more targets. I'm not sure if you have a strong take here. McCarron kind of feels like last week where he's not going to be super highly owned, but he still has the upside. And yeah, he feels like a pretty decent option for tournaments.
Yeah, I feel like we said he was kind of fine last week, and I kind of feel the same way about him this week. He doesn't project bad. He's just expensive, and he's not in the best game environment. I find it hard. I like the under in this game a good bit,
Mm-hmm.
just because of how much DC likes to run the ball. And I mean, what you could say is maybe with the missing O lineman from DC that they struggle offensively means more
Mm-hmm.
possessions for St. Louis, but we don't really have a history of St. Louis being as super aggressive either. So he's fine. Would be totally fine mixing him into like if you were doing 10 or 20 lineups. Obviously, if you were doing 150, you definitely mix
Oh
him
yeah.
in. But I would be totally fine leaving him off my teams if I was doing single entry or 3 max type stuff.
Yeah. Of around these receivers. Hakeem Butler is a guy that I wrote up. He had a 71% route share last week. Granted, Marcel Aitman went down at the beginning of the third quarter. With Aitman legitimately questionable, at least that's how things appear as of the Thursday practice report. Butler is a really interesting option and one that I don't think is going to catch much ownership, even if Aitman sits. Butler had 2 end zone targets last week. I mean, he's a huge body. They really like him near, in the red zone near the end zone. Do you have a strong take on Hakeem Butler?
It's tough to tell because of the way the injuries happened last
Yeah.
week. I mean, he looks pretty good. I mean, he's played in the NFL. He's definitely a bigger guy. Transitioned to tight end in the NFL. So maybe he's just physically can beat some of these guys in the XFL. I don't have a strong take on all the receivers as a whole. Pro would probably be my favorite. And then obviously if Aitman sits, Butler definitely gets a bump. And even if Aitman's in though, I think Butler's also fine if you wanted to do McCarron stacks in some way.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think Prohl will certainly be the most popular there. And then if we assume Aitman's out, Butler will also probably catch a little ownership, but I doubt he's, above 10%. Darius Shepard, I think, will go severely overlooked if Aitman sits. That's a guy who also has NFL experience, is a pretty competent wide receiver on the outside. And he
It's
could
tough.
definitely.
He's just not getting targeted at
Yeah,
all.
yeah. I
He's
don't
out there
think.
running around though. Like he's running more routes than everybody, I think.
Yeah, he's a cardio guy right now, but if Aitman were to sit, my hope at least would be that he would get a little more
Right.
involved in the offense. Running back for St. Louis, also pretty interesting because we have Brian Hill questionable. If Hill were to sit, both Mateo Durant and Kareem Walker would be in play as decent values. We saw a pretty close to even split there. I think Mateo Durant got slightly more work, and I think he got more red zone carries last week as well. I'm very interested in Brian Hill if he manages to play, because I think he's going to go severely overlooked. In week one, he was a bell cow when he was healthy. He played the first quarter around 80% snaps from watching the game, played the fourth quarter, kind of similar deal, missed the second and third with that hamstring injury, missed week 2 with the hamstring injury. What are your thoughts on this St. Louis backfield?
Yeah, I really, really want Brian Hill to be active and play, because he's not going to get popular because there's kind of 3 guys in the backfield, but the other 2 have just been so bad running the ball. Durant is averaging 2.1 yards per carry. Walker is slightly better at 3.1. If Hill's inactive, it's kind of like then it makes Walker or Durant viable, which I don't want to feel like I want to play them because I think they're bad. So I'd rather Hill be active, and then I can mix him in, and he's not going to get that popular because of it. And then if he's inactive, I'll probably mostly stay away. But like you said, it creates a situation where they're going to get a decent amount of work. So you might want to mix them in as well.
Yeah, Kareem Walker, not very expensive. Just double checked weighted opportunity. Mateo Durant actually did almost double up Walker in weighted opportunity last week, had all 3 of the red zone opportunities, but he is more expensive. So, I think I slightly prefer Durant if Hill sits, but I'm not going to go super hard on either guy. This is a pretty valuable backfield overall, at least measured in weighted opportunities. So there is the potential for a big game here. I do think you'll want a piece of the backfield regardless of Hill's status. But yeah, far from, we have some elite tier running back options. Another one we will get to a little bit later. But yeah, it's tough to beat a guy like Morgan Ellison. Alrighty, moving on to the DC side. I will give my my De'Aaron King pitch, and then you can
Every
say
week.
that he's just not even in play. But De'Aaron King, on rushing production alone, if you extrapolate him out to a full game, 33.3 DraftKings points per game. This guy is an absurdly good rusher. The problem is Jordan Ta'amu is going to start this game, at least all signs point that way. And, the real question is just like, how quickly does King get benched, or how quickly does Ta'amu get benched? Because if you tell me it's, some point in the first half, I actually do think King is in play for the 4-game slate and the 3-game slate. Regardless of when Ta'amu gets benched, King is definitely in play for the showdown slate. So it's, it's a really tricky quarterback situation here in DC. Obviously, for fantasy purposes, we just want De'Aaron King to be the starter. And I think, everyone who watches these games would agree that the DC offense looks much better with De'Aaron King at quarterback. How do you feel about this DC quarterback situation?
I'm not doing it, Jake. You can't make me play De'Aaron King. For $400 more, I can play Brett Hundley.
That is a great
which means
point.
He's probably a good play because it feels gross, and then that's how you win $50,000, because you're the only person that plays De'Aaron King.
Exactly. I'll probably make around 30 teams in the big main slate GPP, and I will probably play De'Aaron King on 1 or 2, if only for the brand. If I win 50K with a De'Aaron King lineup, like, that's going to go down in spring football daily fantasy history as one of the great plays. But regardless, I think he's a fantastic play for the showdown slate. I actually really like showdown teams that have both Ta'amu and King, with either one at captain, really. Outside of this, or outside of the really gross quarterback situation, actually, we just got a question about if DiNucci could get benched if he were to fumble again. He's had a lot of turnover issues. I really don't think there's a big benching risk there. He's one of the quarterbacks I'm the most confident in, so I would not worry about that much. We're not factoring that into projections right now. He's got 100% passing share, so I don't know if you have a different take there.
No, we've seen multiple teams mix in QBs, and we've seen zero signs of anything remotely like that in Seattle. So it's just not worth I don't think you have to worry about it really
Yeah,
much at all.
I think Seattle has full faith in this guy. But back to DC, the DC rushing attack, obviously pretty efficient, regardless of who's at quarterback, but especially efficient with De'Aaron King in there. Abram Smith and Raquel Armstead are kind of splitting carries. Abram Smith relatively overpriced. He doesn't project as a super strong value. Raquel Armstead does project as a decent value. I do think he's in play. I mean, realistically, you can play both guys because they, could fall into the end zone once or twice and certainly get you there. I mean, we saw last week the running back scores were just abysmal. I think Abram Smith
He
led
was
all rushers with like 14 DraftKings points. Like
I
you
think
really don't need much.
Borgie outscored him eventually, didn't he, with that
Oh,
last touchdown? But yeah,
yeah, I think he might have gotten there. It was both guys were around like 13, 14 DraftKings
yeah,
points. Like we're
yeah.
not talking big scores here. So if a guy falls into the end zone twice, he's probably going to be the optimal running back. And both of these DC backs are live for that. I think we have Abram Smith projected for a little more red zone work, but he is almost twice the price of
Yeah.
Armstead.
They're not fun clicks, but they
No.
they have viability because of how much DC runs the ball.
Yeah, and the other thing with Armstead too is because he's basically the exact same price as Ellison, he's not going to catch any ownership despite being a pretty decent value. I think we have him. Let's see, we've got him RB4 actually in terms of value right now, and ownership is just not going to reflect that because everyone's going to want to click Ellison instead. So I do think you could play all chalk and just swap out Ellison for Armstead and have a decent team there. Obviously you could argue that the touchdown equity isn't there for Armstead as much as it is for Smith, but it's the XFL.
Yeah.
So anything could happen. Passing attack, I really don't have many guys that I'm interested on the DC side. I mean, Lucky Jackson, I guess is okay.
I think Hammond is also to me, him or Lucky Jackson are more or less the same. Hammond, it looked like Lucky Jackson was going to be like far and away the best receiver on this team, but Hammond caught up to him a good bit in terms of target share and stuff last week. So
yeah,
I don't
think Chris Blair at min price, maybe you could argue he's in play. I don't know. I'm mostly just staying away from this DC passing attack. I think really when you're talking about these guys, it's pretty much only for showdown. Not sure if you have anything else you want to say on the DC passing attack.
Nope. It's we probably should just mention. I think we totally skipped over Teamu, where he's not really playable, right? At 9,400.
No, I'm not. If I'm playing a DC quarterback, it's my boy De'Aaron King, and I really don't want much of him either. At least for main slate, he's slightly more interesting for the 3-game slate. But again, I mean, it's a super high risk play where you're basically just praying Teamu gets benched, like he throws like 2 pick sixes immediately and gets benched. Alrighty, moving on to this second game on Sunday. We have the Orlando Guardians at the Arlington Renegades. This is a 4 p.m. kickoff. Total is 37. Arlington favored by 8.5. I think this actually started as a 9.5 point spread, which is, I mean, pretty insane for a brand new league. Odds makers just incredibly down on Orlando. If you can still find Orlando plus 9.5. I actually kind of like that bet. I thought about it. I don't think any book lists it anymore at 9.5, but if you can find it, I really don't hate backing Orlando at 9.5 because Arlington just isn't very good. Arlington actually touts the highest implied team total of the week at 22.75, higher than Houston, which I do think is a mistake. I mean, the Orlando defense is terrible, giving up 31.5 points per game so far through 2 weeks, but the Arlington offense hasn't shown us a ton so far. Do you have any betting angles you like for this one?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think this game doesn't reach the total by Arlington getting to 22 or higher points. It's because Orlando scores a little bit more than Vegas is expecting them to. So I agree with you.
Yeah, right there with you. On the Orlando side of things, I mean, I really don't have much here. Quarterback, you can't, it's going to be a split. We saw Quentin Dormady got cut for feeding plays to another team's quarterback, which was just a fascinating tale. I guess he's a mole. But that was weird. So at the very least, it's a 2 quarterback rotation between DeAndre Francois and Paxton Lynch. I don't want any part of that. You can play on the running back side of things. You can play Jermaine Martin. He's overpriced. He doesn't project, super well, but I do suppose he's in play. 65% of backfield weighted opportunity is pretty good, second to only Max Borghi. Really, though, I think on the Orlando side of things, the whole conversation kind of revolves around these receivers.
Yeah, they're the only people from the team that I'm really interested in. Latimer is probably my favorite of the bunch. Rambo runs a lot of routes similar to Darius Shepard, but again, is another guy that just does not earn targets. Lance Lenoir is a guy that we think can start to earn more workload as the weeks go on. It's just tough to gauge how quickly that's going to happen. But he's worth taking shots on, I think, as you just want to be early on it and catch it because we saw him dominate in the USFL at such a high level.
Yeah, Lance Lenoir is like actually the Allen Robinson of spring football, where like this dude, like the Michigan Panthers and now the Orlando Guardians. I mean, the quarterback play this man has been faced with is just like objectively terrible, but he's a really talented spring football wide receiver. And I do think he emerges as their top pass catching option eventually. Playing him this week though, there's plenty of risk. He, 50% of routes in his first game, he'd only been with the team for a few days, but at the same time, only one target. And I think it hit him in the hands and he just dropped it. So, there's plenty of risk with playing Lenoir, but I really like him as like a 1 or 2% owned kind of play, because maybe they thrust him into a bigger role and he's, 75, 80% route share. Eli Rogers and, Cody Latimer are both very strong values, and those are guys that I'm going to mix in on a decent amount of teams, especially because we expect Orlando to lose this game and perhaps by a significant amount, which means they're going to have to throw. Latimer, there was a sequence last week near the end of the game against San Antonio where there were a ton of penalties. They got it into goal to go, and I think they ran like 8 plays in a row inside the 10 because of all the penalties, and every single pass they threw was a target to Latimer. So Latimer is their red zone and end zone guy. He's got really strong TD equity. Last week we were way over the industry on him, and it ended up paying off. He scored 13 DraftKings points at 5% ownership this week. Ownership is definitely going to account for the fact that Latimer has excellent TD equity and is pretty close to an every down player for them. But I still like him as a play. He'll be in maybe 15 or 20% of my teams. And then, I like Lenoir as sort of the long shot option.
Yep.
One other guy that I wanted to mention real quick, Kelvin Taylor is the minimum price at running back. He's only 3,000. I mean, we're only projecting him for 4 points right now. He had 35% of backfield weighted opportunity through 2 weeks, but this isn't a very valuable backfield for fantasy purposes. So I think he's clearly, if you're playing a min price guy at running back, Nick Holley, who we'll get to a little later, is a much better option. But I figured I'd at least throw out Kelvin Taylor there as like, if you want to go really galaxy brain on the min price running back plays, Kelvin Taylor is probably the guy for you. Much more interesting conversation to be had on the Arlington side of things. We got a tweet yesterday that Kyle Sloter is now the starting quarterback for the Arlington Renegades. You look around the industry and it kind of looks like most sites are projecting Sloter for a 100% pass share, which I'm not sure is necessarily correct. I mean, Sloter, his preseason numbers are really impressive. If you only looked at that, you'd think this guy might be the best quarterback in the XFL. The problem, though, is that he was really bad in the USFL. He scored more than 20 DraftKings points only once. He was a full-time starter, started every game. And he only averaged around 10 DraftKings points per game in the USFL. And if you aren't very successful in the USFL, I have a hard time believing you're going to be very successful in the XFL. I also think there's a benching risk here. Sloter, though, only 6,000. This is a really interesting spot, and I think probably the most important, sort of decision point at the quarterback position.
Yeah, I think so. We're basically doing like an 80-20 split right now between him and Plitt. And so if you really kind of have to make your own call on this one. If you, because we can't really reflect his ceiling in the medium projection. So if you think Slaughter is going to get a full game, and you should treat him when you put him in your lineup that way, as if he's getting the whole game. you don't want him splitting reps at all. And vice versa, if you think this is going to be somewhat of a shared QB room this week, then it basically kills both guys just because there's better plays at quarterback you can do elsewhere. So I think I'm probably going to have at least a few lineups with Slaughter, as if maybe he does get the full game and like Orlando's not great, they put up points, but I'm definitely not assuming that is the case, and it's gonna keep his projection down a bit for us because of that.
Yeah, I think there will definitely be some people who look at the projection and think like, oh, this guy, very clearly the top quarterback play of the slate. But I mean, he has obvious flaws. One is not being very good, and two is the possibility that Plitt could come in there and steal some snaps. And also Arlington fairly run heavy, only a 56% pass rate this season. So, Slaughter could still start the whole game and just not really do anything because they're so run heavy. And if he doesn't deliver the throws. So Slaughter is obviously he has some warts. And I'm gonna play a little bit. He's at 6,000. He's a little scary to fade entirely, especially if he does get the full game. But I think I'm going to be drastically underweight if he clocks in around 20%, which I think is very possible given how he's projected around the industry right now.
Yep, I think that all makes perfect sense. The other positions are all. Arlington's got running backs and receivers are both pretty interesting though, despite the QB.
Yeah. So that's sort of like the leverage opportunity, so to speak here. I mean, Davion Smith is going to be super popular. We know that he's right there with Morgan Ellison as the top running back play of the slate. Keith Ford was cut, and Keith Ford was really the only other guy who was live for red zone touches in the Arlington backfield. So Davion Smith, I mean, geez, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a 75% snap share and 100% of touches inside the red zone, and especially for a team that's favored by 8.5 points with a 22-point implied team total. It's just a killer role.
Yeah, it's really surprising because so week one, before we knew really anything about how all this was going to shake out, I thought Adrian Killins was a good leverage play because of he's a small, like real fast guy. Maybe his athleticism makes a difference in this spring leagues, and we really didn't see it at all. So and then we get to week two, and Keith Ford's still being worked in. Devion Smith is getting majority, but Killins started to see some work. And now we see Keith Ford cut. But Killins, like I said, he's more of this pass catching, shifty, small guy, which was pretty much what Devion Smith was mostly doing the first 2 weeks, with Ford being kind of the bruiser of the group. So it's really interesting. I don't know what I'd be surprised if they don't add another running back to fill the Keith Ford role. Maybe it was just too late in the week to get somebody on the team and whatnot and up to speed. But for this week, I mean, it makes me really like Devion Smith despite the ownership, just because I don't know. I don't think Killins is going to get a ton of those goal line and red zone looks.
Yeah, I don't think Killins is very live to score. And I mean, like you said, he probably gets a decent bit of the pass game role, but I mean, how much of a pass game role is there going to be if they end up winning by double digits here against a really bad Orlando team? So yeah, I'll certainly, I'll probably come close to matching the field on Smith's ownership. I'd expect 35-40% there, probably just under Ellison. I think Ellison projects as a slightly better value in most places, but I mean, yeah, Davion Smith really right there is an incredibly strong play. Killing's only 3,300. You can play him, but I think you're kind of betting on Orlando to keep it a little close in that scenario. So it may be wise, if in lineups with Killings, you may want to boost guys like Latimer, Eli Rogers, maybe even Lance Lenoir. That's a real galaxy brain pairing, the Lance Lenoir plus Killings there.
We like we said earlier that Arlington has the highest implied team total. So and in a backfield where there's literally only two guys, Killins is definitely viable.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely going to want a piece of this backfield for sure. And I mean, I think you're going to want some of these receivers. Obviously Sal Cannella is sort of the leader for Arlington in the pass game, but Tyler Vaughn's at min price is certainly in play. We have him projected as their number 2 pass catcher right now behind Canella. For me, I think those are probably the only two guys I'm going to play. Lawan Winningham is a little interesting because we saw a decent uptick in his route share last week. He actually forced 2 fumbles on special teams, so maybe that was just the prize for the the 2 forced fumbles. But I mostly just want Vaughns and Canella here. Do you have any strong opinions?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Like you said, Winningham definitely is probably a good leverage play in spots if you need the ownership break. Brandon Arcanado was seems like the loser last week in terms of losing the route share. So he's pretty much out of my player pool. Whereas after week 1, he looked like he might be solid moving forward, but he's pretty much out. But yeah, Vaughn should be much, much, much more expensive than he is.
Yeah.
Just hasn't shown up in the box score yet. So it'll mostly be Vaughns and Canella with a little bit of Winningham mixed in, probably.
Yeah, I think, especially if we assume Sloter is going to be pretty popular, which I I think at this point is a near guarantee. Winningham is a very interesting way of creating a very unique Sloter stack because everyone's going to do Sloter plus Canella, Sloter plus Vaughns, but yeah, mixing in someone like Winningham in there, could keep things a little interesting. All right, moving on to the final game of the slate. We've got the San Antonio Brahmas at the Houston Roughnecks. Kickoff is Sunday at 8 p.m. The total here is 36 points. Houston is favored by 4.5. The only bet that I've made so far this week is over 35.5 here. I don't think anyone is hanging that number anymore, but honestly, even 36, I still like the over. I just, I see these as the defenses are solid, but the offenses combined are averaging 50.5 points per game. I tweeted this out the other night. I think internally, we have the total at what, like 39.5. So yeah, so the over here is definitely tempting. I'm optimistic that we'll see a pretty good offensive performance here. Do you have any leans on bets?
No, yeah, I think you nailed it. The over is enticing, and I think San Antonio, while it's not a ton of value there, I think they can keep it closer than 4 points.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I think their Vegas is selling San Antonio a little short. San Antonio just needs to get pushed a little
Yeah.
bit, and I'm sure we'll get to it. But I think they may have the best QB in this league in terms of just QB talent overall from what we've seen so far. So if they can get pushed into passing the ball more, and we know Houston's going to pass the ball, even though they did take a slight dip last week, which was a little surprising, but they're still going to pass a lot, just not near like the Seattle levels. This game can easily get way higher, closer to 40 points than what it's currently being listed at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and moving on to the San Antonio passing attack, I think you're spot on there. Jack Cohn is like legitimately good. I really wasn't impressed with San Antonio in week 1, but just rewatching their week 2 game, I mean, Cohn looked really solid. He was efficient. He threw a lot of good balls. Through 2 weeks, he's PFF's highest graded passer, leading the league in passer rating and big time throws. I mean, Cohn is a pretty good option at quarterback this week. I don't think he's going to catch much ownership here. Do you have a take on the San Antonio quarterback?
Yeah, I will definitely be playing Cohn this week. Cohn and Hundley are probably my 2 favorite QBs this week, especially leverage QBs. And then you've got like Danucci and stuff, but going to be much more popular. And then he's not too hard to stack with. I mean, we're seeing the slot role for him be like an obsession for him.
Yeah.
It was Landon Akers in week 1. Last week, I think everybody in the industry thought it was going to be Fred Brown, and it was not. It was Darius Robertson, who came up with a 34% target share. I mean, you can play those two, and like it might be like one of the best stacks of the week, and not that popular.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm totally with you there. We have Robertson projected as the pretty clear top receiver value of the week. And yeah, he's just like all the underlying stats in week 2 were really, really strong. A key injury note here is that Jalen Tolliver looks to be extremely questionable. He was limited on, I believe, Wednesday's practice with a groin issue and then bumped down, didn't participate in Thursday's practice with the same groin issue. That makes me think he's probably going to miss. I'm having a hard time figuring out who the biggest beneficiary of that would be. I mean, my lean is sort of that we would kind of spread out Tolliver's targets to, all the other starters because they move him around a good amount. He doesn't really have a set place in the formation. But I mean, I think the biggest beneficiaries would be Darius Robertson, and
TJ Vasher.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and maybe Fred Brown. Like maybe we do see Fred Brown actually play more. I think he had 18 routes last week. Maybe that gets bumped into closer to a full-time role. But I mean, with Robertson at 3,000, it's kind of hard to get away from.
Yep.
So
yeah, I already was playing around before the show with, all right, if let's pull Tolliver's number at least down, and not totally to zero yet, just because we don't know for sure yet.
Yeah.
And my inclination was basically to do what you said, bump the starters. Like most of it went to Vasher, a little bit to Robertson, and then you give a little bit to Travis Johnson and Fred Brown. And then gave a little bit of a bump to Elise Mack too, the tight end. He's not running a ton of routes. He's running over half, but he's getting targets when he's running them though. So I think he is an okay play as well as a pass catcher for this team.
We saw Mack and Dion Yelder both score last week. I think these tight ends are going to be fairly involved in the red zone. So I'm fine with, I actually believe it's pronounced Alize Mack.
Oh.
Yeah, that's what they were saying on the broadcast. I'm trying to make note of the pronunciation so that we can get it right.
Spring football guys.
Yeah. yeah. I think they're all in play. And the best part about this passing attack is like, Cone isn't particularly expensive and the wide receivers are super cheap. So, and it's not going to be tremendously popular. I do think on, if you're playing Cone lineups, you're always going to want to use at least one Houston player on those teams. Before we get to Houston, though, we need to talk about the San Antonio backfield. Don asked in the chat, do you think San Antonio is going to stop running Ballage on first and constantly being in second and long situations? Honestly, I'm not sure. They seem very determined to run the ball. Neither running back that they have seems particularly good. Kalen Ballage is still, Kalen Ballage. At the same time, though, Ballage is certainly live for, 20 carries and red zone work. Granted, we did see a more even split in week 2. What's your take on this running back situation? Because I really don't have like a strong opinion here.
Yeah, it legit might be like the least efficient backfield in the league. It's just that neither of them is giving the team really anything with their carries, which is probably why we're seeing this. Like we saw such the split we saw in week 2. They're just trying to see who can kind of grab hold of this thing and run away with it. It pretty much makes me not really interested in either of them because of that, and because we both kind of think this might be a pace up spot for them. I'd rather just play receivers or stacks with Cone, whatever it is, than try to figure out this backfield.
Yeah, the best part of this offense is the passing attack, and I think especially if they were playing Orlando like they were last week, it's sort of a different story with targeting these running backs. But against Houston, I really only want pieces of the passing game. To be fair, though, Ballage did have I believe it was a 67% route share in week 2, which is really strong. But at the same time, it's also Kalen Ballage, and it didn't result in any targets. So really, I think you just want Cone in these pass catchers here.
If I had to pick one, it would be Ballage, but not really interested in doing that for the most part.
I guess like you could get a pretty unique combination and go like, Cone, Robertson plus Ballage, and kind of hope that it's like more of a San Antonio blowout script and that Houston is actually the team playing from behind for most of the game. That, something like that could be a little interesting. I don't necessarily think I'm going to go that route, but it is viable. All right, moving on to the Houston side. This is America's team. I think we all love the Houston Roughnecks and the way that they're playing offense. The quarterback situation, though, isn't exactly perfect. Brandon Silvers, is a guy that I'm going to play a little bit of because of Houston's pass rate and how explosive this passing attack can be. But the problem is that Cole McDonald is rotating in. He might steal touchdowns. They're mostly just putting him in to run the ball. They're really not giving him many passing opportunities. But yeah, the problem is that, he could run the ball on conversion attempts. He could run the ball at the goal line. He's going to steal some reps there. If we could only project Brandon Silvers for, 100% of the quarterback role, he'd probably be right there with DiNucci in terms of projection. But unfortunately, we can't do that with the way they're rotating McDonald in. Yeah, what are your thoughts on Silvers? Because I'm still not sure how much of him I really want this week.
Yeah, I don't know how much I want of him either. I definitely you can feel comfortable playing multiple Houston pass catchers without the QB. I don't think you have to play the QB, but because of how much we expect them to pass, you can still get away with playing multiple guys that can catch the ball. Yeah, I mean, McDonald had like almost a 20. He's averaging a 20% rush share, which is pretty significant chunk for a quarterback. And it's just enough to make Silvers not look awesome. But he's still viable. I kind of see him kind of like playing AJ McCarron because he's a little bit cheaper. You just know he's also not going to get the full workload.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you there. And I totally agree with your take that you can play multiple Houston pass catchers without Silvers. That's the only team that I think, you can do that. But yeah, I'm having a tough time because I definitely want to play Silvers. Like, there's certainly the scenario where he just throws a bunch of passing touchdowns, racks up a ton of yards, and has a great game. But it really does feel like his ceiling is capped relative to some of these other quarterbacks who we know are going to play every snap. Running back for Houston, I also think is a pretty interesting discussion because we have two guys in Max Borghi and Nick Holley, who I think are pretty solid options. Borghi's 9,000. I had him as RB3 in my TLDR. I think he's probably my favorite pay up option at running back this week. I understand that some of the underlying metrics aren't as good as maybe Davion Smith in terms of like snap share and route share. But the bottom line is, like, when he's on the field, he's getting the ball. 75% of backfield weighted opportunity has come Borghi's way, which easily leads all running backs. So, they want to get the ball in his hands when he's on the field. The problem is that, he's 9,000. So he doesn't project particularly well in terms of value. But I also think that's going to keep his ownership down, hopefully somewhere around 15%, which I'm more than happy with. I'll gladly play Borghi at 15%.
Yep. Yeah. Dejuan Lee let me down last week. I
Yeah,
really
me
thought he
too.
would. They just totally killed his carry share this week
Mhm.
and just gave more of it to Borghi, which was always a possibility. But now, yeah, I like that Borghi is as expensive as he is because it's going to keep his ownership in check and it makes him a pretty good play in my eyes just because there's plenty of other places to save salary. And if I can get different by playing the running back for one of the best offenses, then I am more than happy to do so.
Yeah. Yeah. Davion Smith and Morgan Ellison are such easy clicks that people are just going to have a really hard time getting up to Borghi. And, to me, I think that makes him a pretty great play for tournaments. Nick Holley is, I think he had 100% route share last week. This guy's only playing receiver, but DraftKings lists him as the running back. He's the minimum price. I mean, there's definitely the risk of a zero here, but there's also the possibility of 4 or 5 targets playing receiver.
I don't know if there is a risk of a zero. He
Really,
ran 100% of the routes last week. Obviously, who was out last week for them? I'm blanking on his name.
Travell Harris.
Yes, Travell Harris. When we don't know, he's not on the injury report, right? But he's not listed very high on the depth chart. So I think there's a good chance Holly can give you something. I don't know what the ceiling is, but
Mhm.
I don't think you have to be worried about taking a zero. I just don't know how high it is. And at 3K and in the worst spot to fill in your lineup, the running back spot where no one scores a ton of points,
Yeah.
I think he's a pretty nice click.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like a salary saving option, I think he's pretty strong, and I really don't think many people are going to get there because Morgan Ellison's only 1,600 more and projects, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just drastically better across the industry. So, um, that's certainly a viable option there. Wide receiver is really tricky to project. I know we've talked about this a good amount this week. Um, Travell Harris was inactive last week, and that sort of thrust Holly and Cedric Bird into much better roles. The guys that we know for sure are going to be out there regardless of Harris's status are John Trey Kirkland and Deontay Burnett. I'm not sure if you have a lean between those two. I think I like Burnett slightly more given that he just totally failed last week, only 0.4 DraftKings points at like 50% ownership. I mean, just let a ton of people down. But I do think I slightly prefer him to Kirkland because he's not quite as good of a value, should get a little bit of an ownership discount there. And I'm sure some people will be a little salty about how he performed last week. So yeah, do you have a preference between Burnett and Kirkland before we get to these other guys?
I don't think I have a preference. I do think you're probably on to something saying that he might come in a little bit lower ownership because of the price bump, which, yeah, maybe that makes me lean that way a little bit. But if you need that extra $1,400 or whatever, then to me, Kirkland's also a great click.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there. I think the way to view these wide receivers, and I mean in the interviews I've seen with AJ Smith, Houston's offensive coordinator, he pretty much suggests this is like they're the same guy. They have the same
Mhm.
role and they're, pretty much the same guys. So I just make note of what you think ownership's going to be at and play the lower owned guy. That's
Yep.
how I'm going to try to play it
Probably a
every
good way
week.
to approach it. Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
After that,
beyond
though, it's not
yeah,
fun.
beyond those two, it is really, really tricky. We saw Travell Harris inactive last week. My assumption was that was due to him being limited in practice. So, he didn't get it, whatever the new installs were. He probably wasn't able to participate very much, and they just decided, you're not ready. He wasn't on the injury report at all this week, appears completely healthy, but at the same time, he still has not reclaimed his starting spot on the Houston depth chart. That said, the Houston depth chart was the only depth chart that came out this week that said subject to change. Um,
What does that
so
mean?
exactly right. I honestly have no idea. So it's interesting. I think if Travell Harris is active, we have him right now. I mean, he's right there with Bird and Holly in terms of projection. We do have him slightly above, the wide receiver 3, but only barely. If Travell Harris is active, I view him as a pretty strong tournament play, especially paired with Silvers, something like Harris, Burnett, Silvers as a pretty strong double stack there. Because I think there's a decent chance that he reclaims his week 1 role where he, had like an 86% route share and 11 targets, I believe. So, at the same time, there's also the risk that he's active and that it's much more of a rotation here. So I view Travell Harris as sort of like a high risk, high reward type of play if he's active. Obviously, if he's inactive, you're really only looking at Bird and Holly, and also Ben Putman will rotate in there. But I would say Bird and Holly would probably be the guys I'd want the most of. I don't know. It's a tough situation. I'm very curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think I'm on the same path as you. If Harris is active, he's a good play. It's just high risk, high reward.
Yeah.
Um, I probably because you probably don't ever want to pair Burnett and Kirkland in the same lineup for ownership reasons. So it's probably one of the two, and then pick Harris or Bird or Holly. Even Holly, like you can do stacks that way as well. And then you've got Putnam, like you said, Justin Smith will work in. Even Garrett Owens, the only tight end, works in a little bit as well. You want one of the big two, and then pick one of Harris, Holly, or Bird, depending on who's active and who's not, pretty much.
Yeah, I do wonder if we'll see more of Justin Smith, just given how
Mhm.
bullish offensive coordinator AJ Smith was on him in a recent interview. I know that the industry got a little ahead of themselves, us included. I think on AJ Smith being heavily involved, or Justin Smith, I mean, being heavily involved in this offense. But I mean, yeah, it is really tricky after Burnett and Kirkland. So I would just pay very close attention to the inactives. Obviously, we will get our projections updated as soon as possible to reflect whoever the inactive wide receiver is, because I can't imagine they go in with all, I think it's 7 guys, like all 7 active. That wouldn't make a ton of sense. So it should slim down once we get inactives, but it is really tricky after those two. Final note though on Nick Holly, like, it's kind of a cheat code to play 5 wide receivers in your in your lineup, given how bad these running backs are. So
That's what I'm
that does make
saying.
me,
I think
yeah, that does make me like Holly a little more, where it's just like we can totally abandon the running back position.
if I told you
Um,
you could play a guy on the Houston Roughnecks that's going to run close to 100% of his routes at min price in the running back spot,
yeah, I
he'd be in
mean,
all your lineups.
yeah, it does kind of sound too good to be true. All right, closing things out with some macro slate thoughts here. Honestly, like the main thing that I have is that the chalk this week just feels very, very iffy. I think, like we said, Morgan Ellison, obviously a very strong running back play, but at the same time in a backfield that just hasn't had much production at all. Kyle Sloter, especially, he's a very, very risky play at quarterback. I think he has a lot more downside than industry projections are reflecting right now. Even just getting away from those two guys a little bit will help you create super unique teams. Yeah, I'm curious. What are some of your macro thoughts on this slate?
Yeah, I really like the leverage at QB this week with
Yeah,
Cohen and Hunley. I mean, I'm still deciding what I think of Ellison, but I like the chalk at running back with Devion Smith a lot,
yeah,
and then I just between the QBs and stacking around them, I think it's very easy to get different and not overthink my running back spot too much this week because there's just most of them are not very good anyway, and yeah, and go from there.
yeah. I think unlike last week, I thought was pretty straightforward at quarterback. I only played Danucci and Silvers and a little bit of McCarron. This week, I think there's a lot more opportunity for leverage, especially if Sloter is going to soak up 20% of quarterback ownership. I think that that could definitely make for some compelling spots. And yeah, really, really like Hunley. I think those stacks are going to go pretty underowned. Alrighty, Chris. If you don't have anything else, I think we can get out of here.
No, I'm good.
Alrighty, guys. Well, for myself, for Chris, for producer Sean behind the glass, thank you so much for tuning in to the Week 3 edition of the Fantasy Points XFL Breakdown. I hope to see you all at the top of the leaderboards this week. Good luck.